The impact of the US presidential election on geopolitics and shipping, a multipolar versus a bipolar world, challenge to business of navigating a changing global landscape. Welcome to the latest episode of Chat about Geopolitics and Trade with the Seatrade Maritime podcast, hosted by Punit Oza, founder of Maritime NXT. Today, Punit talks with Rodger Baker from RANE, or the Risk Assessment Network Plus Exchange. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Marcus. Welcome to another episode of Chat about Geopolitics and Trade, a podcast which is all about geopolitics, all about trade, and all about shipping. I've always enjoyed the discussions I've had with maritime CEOs and shipping and trade related personalities on this podcast. But today, I have Rodger Baker. Rodger is the executive director of Center for Applied Geopolitics. And at the end of the day, when you are looking at any sector, you need to take a drone view or a high level view. And I can't find a better person than Rodger to actually talk about geopolitics and all that it encompasses. Welcome, Rodger, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Maybe you can just quickly start with a bit of explanation about your background in this fascinating field and also how RANE Network works and how you're associated with RANE Network. And then we carry on the conversation to very interesting topics. Please.
Sure. So I've been engaged in the field of geopolitical analysis for business since 1997, back when it was a very unpopular idea and no one wanted to talk geopolitics and everyone wanted to talk about a flat world. So worked through the Asian financial crisis. I've worked through the global financial crisis, through all sorts of interesting ups and downs, and been able to watch the ways in which these broader geopolitical events impact business, impact trade all over the place. I started with Stratfor a few years back. RANE bought Stratfor and integrated it into their suite of products and services. And so my Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics, it's inside of RANE as a piece of their overall offerings.
Perfect. And we will talk more about RANE and how businesses can eventually equip themselves with managing these geopolitical risks, which is obviously the key to how you can successfully manage to navigate these challenges. But before that, I also would like to mention to the listeners that my interaction with Rodger has been because I've also got involved with him as a guest on his podcast, which I recommend. And I think it's a great podcast for you to keep yourself updated. At the same time, I also did a 3-day course on certificate in geopolitical analysis, which he instructs and lectures on in the Florida Atlantic University. Except for the timing from Singapore being completely nightmarish, the course was a dream, literally. So I would definitely recommend people to kind of look at that space. It's in virtual or a hybrid course. So this is just a bit of plug-in for you, Robert, but it's worth it. And I can tell you that I've done it myself, so I would heartily endorse it. Coming specifically to the area of US, you're based in Austin, and obviously Texas is a hardcore Republican state in some ways. But I still believe that US presidential election always generates a lot of geopolitical discussions as well. And now they've had a twist. Biden was up in the race, has decided to step down, whether due to his own accord or due to circumstances. At the end of the day, you have a very wide open race now with Harris catching up tremendously. Do you actually see this particular US presidential election being any different from the previous ones? In the sense that, do you see the geopolitical aspects of the global community being concerned about what's happening in America? Does it really affect them as much as it did earlier? Or do you think that influence has waned over the years?
Well, I think that the United States, given its economic heft, given its global military heft, its political power internationally, it is still a place that everyone looks at and everyone tries to understand what's going to happen. Things that the United States does, even domestically, can have international ripple impacts, even if the US leadership isn't thinking about those other countries. And so I think that it really does matter a lot. The interesting thing this time is that former President Trump is not an unknown, as he was during his first run for president when he won. And therefore, there is some elements that we're already seeing of countries being able to take into consideration what they observed in his first term and already start to shift, adapt, adjust, or appease to manage that. At the same time, obviously, with Biden dropping out and Harris stepping in, it doesn't seem as 100% certain, perhaps, as it had, a few weeks ago, that Trump was definitely coming back, and that creates new challenges for countries around the world.
That's interesting. And you're right. I think a lot of the scenario building that you probably do in RANE and Stratfor, as well as a lot of other people do, is based on past experiences. It's obviously history is a massive teacher of what lessons we have learned. Although with Trump, I must say that he does have the ability to shift very quickly in terms of how he thinks and acts. But if you look back at his previous term, he was definitely a more internal looking president, let's put it that way. Even though Biden also kind of brought about these domestic infrastructure investments and things like that, I think Trump was very heavy towards basically trying to, let's say, look at energy, look at aspects where America needs to kind of revamp itself or research itself in some ways, paying hardly any concern to the rest of the world's challenges or issues that really bother the rest of the world. I mean, he has pledged or he's talked about bringing the Ukraine war to a close. He's probably feeling that all the other things are more like noise, but what really needs to happen is America needs to start pushing. And he's done that in past in his own way. The US natural resources, coal exports, and a whole bunch of other aspects, including drilling in Alaska, for example, were all restarted during his time. And he kind of seems to be very happy looking at that. Do you think that his term, with regard to the next one, if he comes in, will be pushing the same agenda forward, which is basically undoing a lot of the stuff that Biden has done in the last 4 years and then restarting exactly from where he left off? Or do you think he is kind of decided that, or he has looked at what's happened around him, and some of the things have worked, some of the things have not worked? Like, for example, the tariffs against China were a fantastic showstopper or something to put out there. But in reality, the trade deficit with China massively ballooned because of the fact that you were simply paying more for the same commodities because you had no alternatives. That lesson has he learned, you think? Or it's not really his style to learn any lessons? He just continues and barges on the way he does. What do you think?
Domestically, that's his primary focus. And the question is, how can he shift or adjust the perception of US strength, of US energy independence, of US economic independence? And so tariffs are a nice, simple, blunt tool. And we do anticipate that if Trump comes back in, that he will continue to pursue tariffs. I mean, he's talking about 60% tariffs on China, 10% tariffs across the board. Probably not necessarily going to see those levels, but we do think that pattern would continue, would pick back up. I think the big difference would be that under the Biden administration, there has been a fair amount of focus on alternative energy, on green type initiatives. And those are things that, at least on the surface, they're not necessarily priorities for the Trump administration, particularly when we talk about energy. It'll be interesting to see how he manages, for example, his relationship with Tesla and Elon Musk, and at the same time argue that, people don't need electric vehicles, they should have gas. But we would see that. A challenge is, of course, there was reopened bidding in Alaska. Very few companies, if any, has actually taken up that bidding. They just don't see the long-term dynamic. So it may be that he will pursue these. It doesn't necessarily mean that business is always going to follow behind it.
Very interesting. And again, I think this is, although in some cases there have been comments from various commentators that every American president is a businessman in his own right, but Trump is literally a businessman in some ways. So he thinks maybe even from one perspective, but he does think from a business perspective, which is interesting from an American presidency perspective. But what I'm really keen to know is that, given the fact that we've decided that this is how Trump looks at things and might look at things if he comes back, the other centers of power, because the multipolar world is a reality today, the other centers of power, be it India, be it China, even the Middle East in that sense, Russia included, they obviously have now started influencing the global space in a bigger way. You had the BRICS earlier, now you have the BRICS Plus, and you have sworn opponents of America, like Iran and others, actually a part of that particular BRICS Plus extended alliance. Now, here lies one of the biggest challenges that do you see the fact that these people or these countries are coming together, they will actually start preferring to do the trade within themselves wherever they get the chance. So, an example would be that if Iran today is importing from a particular country, even certain cargoes are going from the US friendly countries as well into Iran. At the end of the day, those cargoes will shift to the BRICS Alliance plus countries, which can, of course, change trade flows. And what's more interesting for me is, do you actually see the fact that more and more of these countries are looking to do barter deals or non-US dollar deals going forward? Is that a trend that you see will reduce the impact of, let's say, a massive policy from Trump to try and clamp down on these countries because they're really not dependent on US dollar? They're not really dependent on America or its allies for any of the usual stuff because their alliances are growing. Is there a shift now? You think a shift is imminent even with Trump coming in?
So I think that there has clearly been an attempt by multiple countries to adapt to multipolarity, to push back against, particularly in the immediate post Cold War period, what was seen as just the unchallengeable power and heft of the United States, right? The United States not only controls the global reserve currency, it controls the pathways through which money moves. And therefore, it can use its geoeconomic tools to have a tremendous amount of impact, primary sanctions, secondary sanctions, and influence the behavior of many other countries. That said, when you really dig into the use of secondary currencies, when you look at the countries that are supposedly diversifying their currency reserves, it's a very small percent, and rarely is it moving to things like the yuan. It's instead picking up additional euro, additional yen, some extra pound in their currency stocks. It's more of a diversification than a de-dollarization. The other challenge we're seeing as these countries try to work collaboratively, look at the Russia-India relationship, right? So India buys Russian natural resources, oil, gas. What do they get paid in? Well, Russia pays for them in ruble. Well, then what do you do with all the ruble? So India can't use that currency anywhere else. If India pays for them in their currency, Russia can't really use that Indian currency. So now the Russians are trying to find ways just to reinvest in India. It's not so easy to move away from the dollar when the dollar is usable everywhere. And these other currencies just aren't so much. So I think that that's something to keep an eye on. It does create limitations. It doesn't mean we're not going to see additional moves in this way here and there in particular products and particular items, but it's hard to see a wholesale movement unless the Chinese are willing to fundamentally alter the way they take care of their currency to using the yuan, for example, as a primary currency.
Absolutely, and that's a valid point. I think it's still difficult to replace dollar as a default setting for nearly all the international contracts, and that is something that we have always found interesting in shipping as well. I remember the only charter party or the contract where I had to pay in pounds was sugar into London from Mauritius, which was a pre-colonial time agreement which continued on. But these are some of the nuances which obviously create challenges. But let's move a little bit away from US and come to the other two countries that we mentioned, which is China and India. Now, interestingly, in spite of all the rhetoric that goes out there with China and India at loggerheads on the international front, diplomatically, trade wise, they are the biggest partners with each other. And obviously China has such relationships with a lot of the countries which are so-called enemies or opponents of China. In that sense, do you actually see the tightrope walking that China has been doing and India has been doing to really work in terms of trying to create a different power center away from in Asia, at least in terms of that? Because today also the ASEAN has made a statement saying that the South China Sea needs to be more balanced and more secure. The communication channels need to remain open. At the same time, you also had the Indian foreign minister say that. But does it really carry any weight? Because China seems to be kind of carrying out its own policy, irrespective of what international rhetoric does. They seem to be kind of going their own way all the time. Is that the view that you also have?
So I think there's two pieces that we can look at in that respect. One is that when we think about what multipolarity actually means, and not the multipolarity that seems to be the ideal being pushed by China or Russia, which in that sense, multipolarity isn't anything other than saying the US shouldn't be the boss of everyone. But if we think about multipolarity as opposed to the bipolar structure of the Cold War, it is a much more normal way in which the world worked for 400, 500 years um, since the Europeans integrated the world into a single system. Rarely did you have two dominant powers or one dominant power. The British always faced off against the Spanish and the French, and maybe the Dutch. And there were always multiple power centers. And what that means is that the countries in between often find themselves having the ability to walk the line between two or three powers. And that gives them greater strength. So India, rather than now pursuing non-alignment, says they're pursuing multi-alignment. ASEAN is simultaneously working with the United States and working with China. The Philippines, right, bought the BrahMos missile from India, which required the Russians to sign off on it to use it against the Chinese, who are supposedly the Russian ally on the security front. So this complexity is not only in the way in which US allies or partners are relating to the United States, but the way in which the other side, the Russians, the Chinese, and their allies and partners are relating to each other. And I think that's something that we want to keep in mind as we look at this idea of multipolarity. And then when we get to thinking about the Chinese and how they view this, I think that the Chinese still are cautious about not pushing the world into a bipolar structure that forces countries to choose a side. For the Chinese, they are more secure if countries aren't required to pick a side. And that seems to still be a bit of their policy. So as much as they are, asserting themselves in the Philippines, they still have little bits of outreach. Throughout the region, we see them. They're still talking to Ukraine and supplying Russia with the precursor parts for weapons. They're trying not to push too far. That creates the very Cold War that I think would very rapidly be to their detriment.
Interesting. And you're very right about that, that basically they are probably as much involved in the game with America as anybody else, being probably one of the largest holders of US treasuries. So they don't want to upset the apple cart too badly because they'll probably suffer more than anybody else in that respect. And obviously, interesting part is how does trade kind of come into this? Because have we actually seen a decoupling completely of trade from these diplomatic and other rhetorics at this point of time? Asserting your power, asserting your area or reach in South China Sea, for example, or in other parts of the world, doesn't seem to have any linkage with trade anymore because China and Philippines are still very close trading partners. Yeah, China and India are still doing a lot of trade with each other. Is it because they don't have an alternative at this point of time, or they're not searching for alternatives? This is a very interesting part because people talk about alliances, people talk about tensions in certain regions of the world, but it doesn't seem to be really worrying the trade space. The trade still seems continuing unabated, and China is still talking to the rest of the world and supplying all the kinds of stuff to all around the world. Is that trend, you think, continuing?
Yeah, I mean, again, if we go to what does multipolarity means, it means that countries can have three different sets of relationships: an economic relationship, a political relationship, and a security relationship, and they don't have to be fully in alignment. Secondarily, if you think about it globally economically, the United States, China, and the European Union are three massive economic hubs. It's very hard for any country to choose to not do business or engage with all three. They can be blocked by one of them, but for the most part, they want to engage with all of them. In Asia, that is your dominant economy. So of course you're going to still be doing business with it and not walk away. And so that gets us to the idea of decoupling. Decoupling is rather extreme and unlikely, except maybe in very, very thin select sectors. So as we look at this competition, for example, in high-end semiconductors, we may see more and more separation, and there may be two global ecosystems that emerge for manufacturing and trade countries could be operating in both of those ecosystems, but they would have to be operating totally separate supply chains and things like that. What we are seeing is diversification, de-risking, or other D words that are out there that are about creating a little extra buffer. And as we've seen, particularly with supply chains, finding those places where there is an over dependence upon a single geographic area or a single supplier and starting to expand beyond that. So rather than, for example, shutting down facilities in China, just build the next facility somewhere else, but not leave China. And we've seen the Chinese follow this pattern too, as there have been restrictions on Chinese exports. They simply move their manufacturing to third countries to still be able to access the US and the European markets.
Absolutely. The Mexico is a good example. I think a lot of Chinese companies have already set up shop there, trying to use the USMCA as a way of getting into America at some point of time. But that's a very fascinating space because that means that the trade might kind of be looked at independently. But that creates a bigger challenge for companies. So let me start with kind of the big picture. If you look at what you guys do at RANE Network, you kind of have to look at it in multiple levels. You have to look at it from a global perspective, then you have to look at it from a country perspective, and then you have to look it down to an enterprise perspective, a company perspective, and then you have to interact with all the three levels in order to find strategies. Not an easy job. So how do you kind of pitch this entire space, because you have so many moving parts? Fascinating space for you to actually advise companies how to go through this maze of challenges that exists. Some sharing on that.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways of thinking about how that's done. One is to really blend geopolitical analysis as a framing tool with traditional intelligence analysis as your bottom up and picking it apart. So we use geopolitics to be able to build models and frameworks of the world. We're constantly building alternative future scenarios and trying to understand what are the most significant drivers of those scenarios. The total number of variables is too great. Everybody who
Right.
wants to just throw it into an AI generator and pump something out through variables, you'll never have enough variables. I refer to Asimov's Foundation series, right? Harry Seldon had his little magic box. And what was the data required in that? It was information on every human all times to be able to start coming up with those patterns. So I think the more nuanced you get in building the broad patterns, the more information you need and you'll never stop. So we build broad patterns. Those define a set of questions that then we can drill into through traditional tactical intelligence and pick it apart. We also build a structure internally that is what I would call a tapestry structure rather than a patchwork quilt structure. So rather than a bunch of independent experts on a particular topic or theme or country who you can just sew into the fabric and then take out and sew back in and things like that, we work under a combination, a cross-functional structure of areas of responsibility, geographic areas of responsibility, and thematic areas of responsibility. And we're constantly blending who's working on any particular issue or product to bring those different focal points together into an integrated whole. And then finally, every single day, we bring the entire team together to talk about things on a global front so that we can see the linkages between things that may appear to be local or regional or sub-regional or things of that sort, how those can have an impact further abroad and how the world stays. As Mackinder pointed out, and lots of people by the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, there is no empty space in the world anymore. And therefore, something that happens in one part of the world will ripple out and impact all other parts of the world.
Basically, this means is, in simple terms, it's like giving essentially some kind of X-ray vision to the participants who can actually see through these things. You cannot really remove those challenges, but at least you know the path in front of you has these pillars or blocks that you need to avoid hitting into, but you really don't have the ability to ensure that those blocks will not change color, texture, as well as form. So it's a very interesting space. What you're really equipping as people is just the eyesight to be able to view these blocks in a more clear fashion. That doesn't mean that you don't have to take proactive action to actually pass through those blocks in a safe fashion. Is that assessment correct, Roger?
I think so. Basically, it's putting clarity on the environment, the constantly changing, shifting, and evolving environment. But if you're navigating an aircraft, the more you know about the topography below you, the weather patterns above you and around you, the better you are at adjusting to them. Traditional geopolitics is the tool of states, and states are the primary actors on the international stage, even though some people would argue certain multinational organizations or non-state actors are. But states are the primary center and focal point of global regulation. They are what define whether people, product, information, or currency can move across borders. And that is what trade is all about, right? The movement of those across borders. So states are that primary thing, and geopolitics was designed with states in mind. When we move it to applied geopolitics, we're now saying, look, the businesses are not necessarily the primary actor who can fundamentally alter the international system. But if they can understand these paths and patterns and look forward to those changes, and then build a set of indicators to monitor to say which way are we moving and how is it going, they can start to adapt and adjust not only to avoid pitfalls or to identify risk, but also perhaps to tease out new and unexpected opportunities. And I think it's always important in this field, it's easy to focus on risk. Risk is super easy, but it's really important to also think in terms of opportunities that emerge out of any change in the situation.
Absolutely. I think that's a very fascinating take, and I fully agree with you. There are massive opportunities hidden in that. I think we're coming to the end of the podcast, but the last question that I always have, because as you know, I teach geopolitical risks and impact on shipping trade flows in a few universities and business schools as well. And a lot of my students listen to these podcasts. In fact, most of these students have this podcast as their pre-reading material or pre-listening material, as we call it, for the lectures. So when a student is looking at this particular topic, and you have now had decent amount of experience in Florida Atlantic University running this course, which I mentioned earlier, what do you see is the kind of one takeaway? What is the one thing that they should kind of go back after learning a course or studying geopolitics? What is it that should make them different from what they were before they came on the course? What is that one quality that you're trying to look in the students which they can imbibe after thinking about geopolitics and learning about geopolitics? Is it curiosity or is it something else?
Curiosity is probably about the best answer there is. It's a desire to constantly pick apart, right? And the ability to see in different scopes and scales simultaneously, right? So looking across long periods of time to right now, looking across broad geography to narrow geography, and to think not just in the moment, but to think in the moment as a piece of the flow of history and as one spot in a constantly expanding geographic framework around it. And if you can start to change your mind to think in that way, you will see things very differently. You'll be able to find and tease out those questions that you wouldn't have thought of before. And those can put you down on the path to, again, identify that opportunity, to see that risk, to anticipate future change, and no longer to be stuck in the daily cycle of information volatility.
Absolutely. Well put. I think that was very well summarized, Roger. That brings us to the end of the podcast. And thank you so much, Roger. It's always a pleasure talking to you. I am sure that we will continue to remain in touch because the world keeps changing, but we keep talking. And that's the way it should happen. Thank you so much for your time and all the very best. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you for listening to the Seatrade Maritime podcast, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode.